Hey everybody, it's Sunday evening, and I got to tell you, you caught me. This past month has been the strangest month I've ever had, physically speaking. But I've moaned about that enough, haven't I? But we're talking about bodies, and so we might as well acknowledge that we are dust, feeble and frail, and sometimes our bodies um, just aren't up to the task. I'm still getting over this virus that has just wreaked some havoc on me in several different ways. I won't go into details, but appreciate your prayers and your patience. Well, you know, as I reread Shelley Rambo's chapter, Touching Wounds, and um, was reminded of these stories of Macrina. One of the things that really came to the fore for me was the role that hands and touch play in this chapter, particularly in Macrina's relationship to her mother, and then when she takes the child of the soldier's wife into her arms in healing touch. On 58, at the top of the page, uh, Rambo writes, "The bare earth and the bare skin are all marked in time, but the mother continually in wombs, implying a continuation of relation. The divine visitation is the work of hands, and we come to see that it is not the grand work of redemption that saves, but the touch on wounds that is rarely accounted for, but marked nonetheless. The divine was here." So this phrase, the work of hands, is an interesting one. She's dealing a lot, of course, with the Gospel of John, and it just so happens that this is the one gospel where we read of Jesus uh, bending down to wash his disciples' feet with his hands. And remember that his instruction is to quote, "As I have washed your feet, so are you to wash one another's." And one of the things I believe to be the case about the early, what we call the Johannine community, or the churches that were deeply shaped by and probably sort of configured their identity around this gospel, the Gospel of John. I'm pretty convinced that they were foot washing people. Um, After all, this gospel says that, I mean, Jesus makes it just as much an explicit command as, the Lord's Supper or baptism or anything else. Blessed are you if you do these things, we read in the Gospel of John. And the context is about washing feet. So I'm thinking about washing feet. I'm also thinking about, things like the laying on of hands in ordination. And I think the role of the laying on of hands or anointing with oil for prayers of healing. And so hands figure there, don't they? And then near the end of the chapter, uh, page 68, this is the first big paragraph on 68. As Macrina cradles the infant in her arms, her part, meros is the Greek, now a healing agent, touches other parts. As such, she enjoins others to gather, linking the disciples together and reorienting them from gazing at wounds to assembling them through the power of touch. So, Rambo is doing some very creative work in suggesting that in some way, perhaps at some level, perhaps not at a conscious level, Gregory is in some ways reconfiguring the story of the Gospel of John with Macrina as we'll say, a Christ figure, and with this power of touch. I like all this, but thinking about the phrase "the power of touch" and then the work of hands in that earlier page, and I've already mentioned, of course, washing of feet, laying on of hands, and ordination. It's an interesting practice, isn't it? And then again, the place of touch in healing prayers and ritual anointing with oil. Such things as this, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it's the Gospel of John. I'll say again, the only gospel that talks about Jesus washing feet or enjoining his disciples to do this. And it's the gospel that at the beginning is strong in its insistence that the Word, the divine Word that was with God in the beginning and shares equally in God's nature, that Word became flesh and lived among us. Here's what I'm thinking about, though. I hope you'll be able to sort of see how this connects with the pre-recorded videos I have on Macrina and Gregory in their discussion about the soul and the resurrection, because I will tell you by way of anticipation that what Macrina does in that conversation is nothing short of revolutionary, given her setting, the categories of Greek philosophy that she inevitably had to work with. What she has to say about the soul is really remarkable. Now, here's the other thing I'm thinking then. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we know that Jesus certainly did employ touch. And Rambo in this chapter talks about the power of touch and the healing hands. But we also live in a culture where touch, for very good and legitimate reasons, is a potentially explosive issue. What is legitimate touch? What about uninvited or unwanted touch? What about the touch that's loaded with inequities of power relations and authority? And so we know, and I mean misused authority in this case, we know the potential, the destructive potential of touch as well. And as ministers of the gospel, a gospel of the incarnate Word, we affirm the goodness and the redeemability of bodies and the importance of touch, but we're also, we live in a charged atmosphere, and I'm not going to say, again, understandably and justifiably charged atmosphere, because touch so often has been, abusive and rapacious and destructive. How do we walk that line? How do we teach our people to, as it were, walk that line? Can we become overly concerned? And I'm really asking this as an open-ended question about maybe our culture's reticence about touch. Should touch be different within the church? What is the place of the power of hands and healing touch within the church? And how do we guard against the abuse of that kind of power? These are some of the questions that are on my mind, and I'm going to try to formulate an assignment. I'm now at that place where I'm just trying to stay a little bit ahead of you because this illness has really kind of slowed me down. But be watching for more assignments. I don't want to do assignments just for the sake of doing them, but in fact, because I've been told I have to have X number assignments, discussions, interactions per week. So sometimes I just as soon, keep it low key. We may have to talk about the last 2 weeks of the class and see how we can, how we'll navigate those. But we have time to do that. All right, this is good for now. And there's nothing particular that you have to respond to in this lecture. This is just an introductory to the week. Sure do appreciate you all and all the hard work you're doing. Blessings.